Military conscription, all year round.
They managed to systematize their database, first of all, through medical institutions.
Total access to human resources.
They can draft people in any numbers, either to replace losses or to send them as so-called little green men.
Deception and coercion as motivation to fight.
They say, you will be a cook or a technician in the rear, in the Rostov region, just driving people around. You are not going to the front.
Back then, Donetsk locals themselves called it the city of black headscarves.
And torturing killings of those who refused.
Refusal to serve means brutal punishment, torture, and being thrown into what they call the pit.
Soldiers with sticks, wounded, some without arms, some without legs.
Russia turns those it claimed to be liberating into cannon fodder. Watch this in the special report, Forced to Kill Their Own. How Russia uses Ukrainians in occupied territories. Conscription all year round. From January 1st this year, Russian authorities ensured fresh manpower for the army, so-called new blood. Since Russian legislation is also imposed on the occupied territories, the very same fate now awaits men of draft age living in the occupied areas of Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk regions, as well as in Crimea. Now, all men aged 18 to 30 living in temporarily occupied territories are at risk. Russian occupiers are compiling a complete population registry to record addresses, control movement, and keep accounts. In Kherson region, the Occupation Administration launched a campaign to attach residents to clinics under Russian mandatory health insurance. Officially, this is called streamlining medical services.
As for the draft, they managed to systematize their database primarily through medical institutions, with particular focus on men of conscription age. Medical facilities transferred this data to military enlistment offices. As a result, they now have a more or less complete database of the population currently living in the territory that, under their legislation, is subject to conscription. There are still people who have not registered for military service, but it has become extremely difficult for them to avoid the attention of the occupiers, because official employment, access to social benefits, humanitarian aid, and other basic services are no longer possible. In effect, they have created a direct link between everyday survival and registration with their military enlistment offices.
Russian propaganda, relying on its familiar set of cliches about duty to the motherland and the legacy of past wars, promotes stories about yet another successful draft under occupation and claims that the new recruits will not be sent to the front.
And then people go wherever, some to training, some to work, and some might decide to stay on contract.
When people are drafted for compulsory service, they end up in a military unit under a commander. It becomes very easy to pressure them in different ways. They offer incentives, payments. In occupied territories, there are very few ways to earn a living other than serving. And there is coercion. When a person is inside a unit, it is easy to threaten them, to say that if they do not sign a contract, they will be sent straight into assault units. There were cases where contracts were signed retroactively without the person's consent, leaving them with no options.
These are promises and deception. People are told they will not end up on the front line, even though everyone knows they will. Those who sign always believe others were deceived, but not me. It works like fraud schemes. The outcome is always the same. In the end, every sixth prisoner of war is a former Ukrainian, and Russia does not take them back. That is one reason why exchanges are so difficult.
In occupied parts of Luhansk and Donetsk regions, where after so-called liberation, Russian forces looted and almost completely destroyed industrial enterprises, metallurgical plants and coal mines, recruiters from Russia exploit this reality.
Half a year ago, a recruiter from Moscow, Belgorod, or any Russian region would say, look, your so-called DNR, or Zaporizhzhia region, pays $800,000 as a signing bonus. In Moscow, we will pay you 2 million. Back then, if you agreed, you had to travel to Moscow, sign the contract, then go to your unit. Now they come with cash already here. They say you will be a cook, a technician in the rear in Rostov region, just transporting people. You are not going to the front.
Given the economic situation in occupied territories where there is basically no work, you can work construction or go to what they call the mainland, to Russia, installing windows or doing odd jobs. Miners, generations of miners go to Russia to install windows. It is a disgrace. The economy is so broken that posters are everywhere saying sign a contract with the Russian Ministry of Defense and you will get money and happiness.
60% go not out of ideological conviction, but because there is simply no way to find work in the occupied territories. Industry is not operating. There are no jobs, no income, no money. And so the occupation administration deliberately creates a single artificial option. A man of working age cannot provide for his family, and he is left with only one real choice: to sign a contract with the Ministry of Defense. And after that, it is the familiar ending: either a token handout for the family or a ceremonial certificate.
In addition to year-round conscription and incentives to sign contracts, Putin signed a decree calling up reservists for military training after the State Duma expanded their role in October. This hybrid mobilization will allow Russia to replenish its forces by at least 1 million people within a year. The occupied territories will not be left out. In Luhansk region, occupiers have already begun mobilizing the first reservists, officially claiming it is only for guarding infrastructure facilities.
There is a provision for sending them to special training to protect life support facilities, energy infrastructure, transport, oil refineries, and other infrastructure, only within their home region, primarily to counter drones. The deployment of reservists to special training, as well as to other military training, will be carried out on the basis of a decree by the President of the Russian Federation.
Analysts at the Institute for the Study of War believe that by using active reserve personnel, the Kremlin aims to maintain the tempo of combat operations without announcing a second wave of mobilization, since the aggressor state illegally wrote Ukrainian Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, Luhansk, and Donetsk regions, as well as the temporarily occupied Crimean Peninsula, into its constitution as Russian territory. Reservists who sign contracts can be sent to serve there, and residents of those territories can be mobilized as well.
Intensive work with reservists is underway. This is not just about calling them up. They are not simply sitting and waiting to be summoned. Mechanisms of constant engagement are being created, regular training, exercises, and so on, so that at any moment, in any numbers, they can be drafted into the Russian armed forces, either to replace losses in Ukraine or to be sent as so-called little green men somewhere to NATO's eastern flank.
These are recent images from occupied Yenikiev. Armed representatives of the so-called military commandant's office are checking passengers on a public bus. Some are taken away with them. So-called internal filtration has intensified under occupation. Telegram channels published dozens of photos showing armed visits, often by men without insignia, to apartments and private homes. The pretext is searching for those evading mobilization or who deserted their units. Ukrainians from occupied territories, just like Russian soldiers, are expendable material for meat assaults. This was shown by the 2022 mobilization announced by Putin at the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. From the so-called DNR and LNR, which the Kremlin preemptively declared part of Russia, men were scooped up indiscriminately, healthy and sick alike.
People were mobilized without any consideration of disability or health status that would grant deferment. Literally the same day, without any chance to contact family, they were taken straight from enlistment officers to combat positions. They complained they were not properly supplied with clothing or weapons. In essence, they were simply thrown onto positions to make up numbers. Refusal to serve either before mobilization or already at the front, led to brutal punishments, torture, and being thrown into the so-called pit for refusers.
I wanted to record a short video explaining why I decided to throw this rifle away. It has non-original parts. I tried firing it. It is useless. It is about as useful as a gramophone.
This video was obtained by journalists from the Russian online outlet Astra. A serviceman from the so-called 5th Motorized Rifle Brigade, named after terrorist Zaporizhzhia, complains about unusable weapons. For speaking out, the soldier was labeled a deserter and sent to a basement in a private house in Ocheritina, Donetsk region. There, commanders motivate so effectively that even those who cannot walk end up running to the front.
Soldiers with sticks, wounded, some without arms, some without legs. They are sending all of us to war today.
Putin later rewards and decorates his own commander's sadists who brutally abuse their subordinates. Major General Pavel Klimenko was awarded the title Hero of Russia for so-called heroic service. In reality, for organizing a torture concentration camp for Russian soldiers at the abandoned Petrovska mine in Donetsk. According to Astra, there are already more than 23 such torture sites for their own troops supplying human material to the front, and that is only in Donetsk region.
I was wearing only underwear when they inflicted injuries on me. I was handcuffed to a flagpole for 3 days. They did not give me water. When I lost consciousness, they called a local medic who injected something to bring me back. They poured water on me. They beat me with a rubber baton and a handle like from a shovel.
The exact number of Ukrainians forcibly mobilized into the Russian army since the start of the full-scale invasion cannot be determined. According to the Coordination Headquarters for the Treatment of Prisoners of War, the figure is 46,327. Ukraine's main intelligence directorate reported 60,000. The largest number comes from Crimea, more than 35,000 people. In Sevastopol, 5,368. The same number in the occupied part of Donetsk region. In Luhansk, more than 4,500 men were forced into the occupiers' army. In Zaporizhzhia, 560. In Kherson, 478.
Meat. What we see is meat crawling over other meat, just to seize another kilometer of land at insane cost.
Even locals called Donetsk the city of black headscarves. There were so many widows, and there still are, but they all keep silent because they are not allowed to speak.
In this way, the Kremlin not only replaces the catastrophic losses of the Russian army, but also solves a demographic problem in the seized territories, getting rid of potentially disloyal populations.
The local indigenous population is being replaced by newcomers, citizens of Russia, from depressed regions and migrant labor. These processes are becoming uncontrollable and increasingly systemic. In the occupied parts of Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts, there is even a term, women-only villages. Settlements where there are virtually no men left at all. Entire communities have been emptied of male residents. The situation is critical, even at facilities that are part of essential infrastructure, where there is simply no one left to do the work. The same is happening in coal mining. Women are now being recruited en masse to perform jobs that were traditionally done by men, including physically dangerous and exhausting labor. This clearly points to an acute shortage of qualified male workers, even in sectors that require strength, experience, and specialized skills, such as coal mining.
And soon there will be no one left to replenish even young specialists. In 2022, in the so-called LNR and DNR, even students were mobilized because deferments for university students were introduced only months after the full-scale invasion. There were also those who went voluntarily, raised on myths about Nazis in Ukraine, oppression of the Russian language, and threats to the so-called population of Donbass.
A memorial hall for students mobilized and killed in February 2022 Responsible young men reported for assembly despite having legal deferments. They were not subject to either conscription or mobilization. Their parents never expected such deception. Lies, coercion, and state indifference led to the deaths of hundreds of these boys.
Putin plans to destroy Ukrainians by using their own hands in the long term. In occupied areas, people are placed on military registers starting at 16. And in the so-called republics, future fighters are molded from kindergarten age. At school, these skills are refined.
Unarmia is everywhere. Patriotic messaging starts in kindergarten. Children are dressed in caps and military uniforms and told stories. Matryoshka, Putin, all of it. They are prepared to become warriors. They are fed the same nonsense we were fed as kids. The Great Patriotic War. Alexander Matrosov throwing himself onto a machine gun. Pavlik Morozov betraying his father. Children are taught to die for the motherland, for Putin, for the supposed good of great Russia. They absorb it. For them, it becomes normal, a foundation of life.
This is a full-scale campaign to convince schoolchildren and teenagers to sign contracts after graduation. They are told this is the best and most correct decision of their lives. The age threshold was lowered from 21 to 18. Previously, higher education was required, or contracts could be signed only months after conscription service began. All of these safeguards have now been removed. Any school graduate who turns 18 is immediately drafted, sent to serve, and can sign a contract the very same day.
The forced conscription of residents of Ukraine's occupied territories into the armed forces of the occupying state constitutes a violation of international humanitarian law. The 1949 Geneva Convention explicitly prohibits an occupying power from forcing persons under its control to serve in its armed forces or auxiliary formations. Any form of pressure, including threats, administrative coercion, restriction of rights, or the creation of conditions that in practice compel a person to serve, is also classified as a violation.
In fact, even compulsory service itself is a violation. This is a carefully planned and comprehensive policy of the Russian Federation. It begins with forcing people to obtain Russian passports. There is an entire system of coercion built around passportization in order to draw people into service.
For the Putin regime, it is advantageous to send former Ukrainian citizens into the meat grinder first, and to sell it to a domestic audience. Russia is accused of not valuing the lives of its own citizens. We do value them, they claim. Look at who is being sent to die. These are not Russian citizens. From a military standpoint, there is no real need for such forced mobilization. In this sense, it becomes not a necessity of war, but a tool of repression, entirely in line with the logic of the Kremlin.
The Kremlin forces Ukrainians from occupied territories to go to the front, to fight against their own homeland. Putin has no military necessity to do this, but he does have the desire to destroy as many Ukrainians as possible. This is a deliberate strategy, to use people in occupied territories as a convenient resource. They are sent to the most dangerous zones, where death is not a risk, but a statistic. This is not just cruelty. It is a violation of the core principles of international humanitarian law, with clear signs of genocide. Responsibility for these crimes will be borne by all involved: the aggressor state, those who issue the orders, and those who carry them out through deception and violence, knowingly sending people to their deaths. Olga Mihalyuk, Special Report.